Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wendal DCI Consulting Joint Webinar Series. So this is part two of our three-part installment or three-part series. This is how to measure inclusion and what to do next. So I'll introduce the speakers in just a moment, but first, just a couple housekeeping notes. So the webinar format, so all participant phone lines have been muted. Uh, to submit any questions you may have for the presenters, please email news@dciconsult.com. Also, if you happen to have any technical difficulties during the call, send that same email a message and we'll get everything straightened out for you. Then just a little bit about DCI Consulting. So our mission is to advance workforce equity and organizational effectiveness through our dynamic client partnerships. And we do this because we believe every person deserves equal opportunity and fair treatment in the workplace. So DCI is a one-stop shop for your HR analytics needs, and some of our services include OFCCP compliance, diversity, equity, and inclusion research and consulting, pay equity studies, personnel selection, EEO litigation support, and testing and validation work. We believe that having clients and partners that are aware of the latest knowledge and support in the industry is important to everyone's success. So for this, we offer a few resources. Some of these are our monthly webinars, which feature experts discussing a range of topics, and these are complimentary, such as the one you're watching right now. There's our client services or resources portal, which offers web-based training on EEO and affirmative action goals, as well as our award-winning DCI blog. And so to introduce our speakers for this event, so first we have Dr. Mark S. Nagy, who is Chief Research and Behavior Officer at Wendal Inc. And then there is myself, Chad Peddie. I'm a consultant at DCI Consulting in the Workforce Equity Group. So in terms of our agenda today, we have a few points that we're going to cover. So first, we'll just do a brief recap of some of the highlights of our first part, why inclusion matters. Then we'll talk about the importance of appropriately measuring workforce dynamics. Then we'll identify the 5 key dimensions of workplace civility. Next, we'll talk about how the measurement of workplace civility can contribute to other organizational studies, and I'll talk about a couple of those. And finally, we'll talk about proper interpretation and results of measurement and potential action steps. So first, just to recap some of the topics from the last installment, just so everyone's on the same page. I'll just go over first some of the outcomes of increasing civility. So there are a number of topics that we discussed last time. So when we think about increasing civility, so there can be increases to employee attitudes and perceptions. So things like a sense of inclusion can increase. There can be increases in the sense of contribution to the common cause or purpose of the organization. At times we'll see higher levels of performance, both in task and organizational citizenship, increases in job satisfaction, in innovation, decision making, and creativity, higher perceptions of organizational justice and fairness. We'll see lower instances of turnover and absenteeism, as well as lower incidences of EEO complaints. Also, in terms of benefits, we may see things such as lower costs associated with things related to civility. So lower sick leave and costs associated per employee in terms of sick leave. We may see lower annual EEO formal complaints per facilities, as well as differences in perceptions of colleagues who are seen as civil. So um, we colleagues who are civil are more likely to be seen as leaders. Also, those colleagues may be sought out more for advice as they're seen as more supportive. Also, those individuals may be perceived as more technically competent and have higher performance ratings. And then, so we're understanding the same general terms. We have a number of definitions that we went over previously. So just to reiterate some of those. So in terms of civility, formal definition offered from research from Pearson, Anderson, in Porath, 2000. So demonstrating sensibility of concern and regard, treating others with respect, workplace civility is behaviors that help to preserve norms and mutual respect for work. Comprises behaviors that are fundamental to positively connecting with others, building relationships, and empathizing. So some of the key components of that are treating others with respect, mutual respect for work, and behaviors that are positively associated with connecting with others. In terms of incivility, from Anderson and Pearson, 1999, can be thought of as low-level intensity deviant behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target in violation of norms for mutual respect. And then with regard to inclusion, we can think of that as creating opportunities within a working environment where employees feel valued, heard, considered in the decision-making process, and generally part of something larger than themselves. So next we'll go on to talk a bit about the importance of appropriately measuring workplace dynamics, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mark. Mark?
Alrighty, thanks, Chad. When we look at assessing workplace civility, there's some typical inclusion assessment techniques, if you will, that we typically we can go at looking at civility a couple of different ways. So a typical inclusion assessment could involve a qualitative approach. So, for example, looking at the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility related policies and procedures. So these would be the policies and procedures in place at an organization. We could review their DEIA related programs that they have, that they're offering their employees or that are available to employees. Certainly, we could review their training programs and see what kind of training they're engaging in. We could also conduct focus group discussions or even conduct individual interviews with employees to try to get an idea of what level of inclusion seems to be in the atmosphere, in the work environment, by talking to individual employees. So that's the kind of the qualitative approach. The quantitative approach would be looking at employee engagement surveys, or and as we'll talk about in a second, maybe specifically civility in the workplace assessment, inclusion surveys as well, or something called a social network analysis, which is pretty cool. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. This social network analysis, as the screen says, it uses mathematics and graphics to understand relationships. Now, what a social network analysis does is it allows us to measure inclusion, and it can help us answer the question, who are the key influencers across the organization? And are there areas of the organization that are isolated from these key influencers? So what we're doing is we're looking at people within the organization and the people that are oftentimes the conduit of information throughout the organization. So we can gather and leverage that information about patterns of communication to help uncover relationships between people and those key influencers. So what this analysis does is it goes beyond the simple measures of like a numerical representation of a survey, an employee engagement survey, or if we're doing qualitative analysis, the results of that, to uncover the informal communication network within an organization. And by doing this, we measure not just diversity, but we also measure inclusion. So basically, are people aware of the goings and daily business within an organization? There are three key objectives from a social network analysis. The first is the relationship between network connectivity and other variables. So for example, we can look at the connectedness by race, sex, age, etc., over all the entire organization. So how are those communication channels across the entire organization, or at different organizational levels, or at maybe even within departments or groups? So again, what we're looking at is the connectedness. We can examine the different rates of assimilation of information across those different organizational levels. And this can help us measure the impact of DE&I initiatives. With identifying key influencers, that's also a key piece of the social network analysis. And by identifying those key influencers, we can identify if there's a shortage of key influencers somewhere along the communication network, or perhaps in some groups. So maybe some groups are not getting the information that they should on a daily basis, a weekly basis, but the point is they're not getting the information they should, and because of that, they're being excluded from different activities within the organization. By identifying those key influencers, we can increase the influence or connectedness of those influencers in some groups. So we may identify a gap and then push information to a key source that then that person can push that information forward to other groups or teams. Again, and by doing this, we can promote these DE&I initiatives through those key influencers. The third objective of a social network analysis is to examine the connectedness among different groups. So we can identify pockets of inclusion, but also pockets of exclusion. Again, and by looking at the connectedness among different groups, who knows what, when, that can, again, help us to understand what folks are being included and also excluded. We can identify if there exist sex or race or age silos, folks that aren't getting this information based on perhaps some sort of demographic characteristic. And by doing that, we can identify the best practices to be more inclusive in the areas of the company. And a great, perhaps present day example could be perhaps some people who are working from home aren't getting the same amount or type of communication as those that are in the office. So it may not even be something based on sex or age or race. It could perhaps be where they work. But the key thing with the social network analysis is by examining the communication channels and the flow of communication, we can help identify pockets of inclusion as well as exclusion. So that's one way that we can try to assess inclusion in organizations. Another way we mentioned are through surveys, and that's primarily what we're going to focus on for today. Measuring team civility in the workplace. If we look at the history of measuring, or at least attempting to measure civility in the workplace, historically, the research and measurement has focused on incivility in the workplace and not civility. Now, we mentioned last week that civility and incivility are a little bit different from each other, but I think it's important to point out that not only are they different from each other, but that most of the research and most of the assessments that we find in research and practice focused on incivility and not civility. So there's very little research and very few assessments of civility that even exist. Those that do exist that measure civility only measure overall civility. And I say only, not because that's a bad thing, but that's a key feature. In fact, most of the assessments of incivility also only measure overall incivility. So for example, if we're looking at civility, is an organization relatively high in civility, or are they about average, or are they lower than average on civility? Kind of continuing on with this historical perspective, there's some limitations of this. So the point here is, if we're going to look at see what's been done in the past, if an organization wants to assess civility, kind of the current landscape, what's been done in the past, not a whole lot has been done in the past in terms of measuring civility. Again, the focus has primarily been on incivility. And the issue with that is, as we've covered in part one, although incivility and civility are related, they're not opposite ends of the same continuum. They have some different characteristics about them. For example, incivility tends to be more individually based, or if you will, the perceptions are more come from the individual, whereas with civility, the perceptions tend to be more team-based or group-based. So right there's a difference almost in terms of the frame of reference when we're looking at incivility and civility. Those measures that do exist of civility, those overall measures, don't provide insight into the root causes of the problems or how to best intervene. If a group is, say, relatively low on civility, okay, they're relatively low on civility, but we really don't know why that is or how to attack that. So that's an issue, if you will, with overall measures of civility. The other assessments that exist, you might say, are called oftentimes homemade assessments. In other words, a company will come up with a couple questions that they feel measure civility, but those assessments that are developed ad hoc may not truly measure what they were intended to measure. We don't know, because we haven't really done the background work to ensure that if we come up with 3 or 4 questions, that they really do measure civility. So because of this, we need to recognize the importance of assessment when we're looking at civility in the workplace. And again, civility is thought to certainly be related to inclusion. Pardon me. I keep a little Post-it note on my computer. A friend of mine said this once, and I was so struck by it. I literally wrote it down and kept it on my computer. And I'm not the kind of guy that does that all the time. But the saying is, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. Prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. So in other words, if an organization just partakes in some sort of intervention and hasn't done any sort of diagnosis, that's a bit strong language saying it's malpractice. But I mean, I think to me that demonstrates the importance of assessment. We just can't go ahead and go forward and undertake some intervention without knowing where the issues are. And with this importance of assessment, what we can do is, if we've got a good measure of civility, we can understand pockets of high and low civility in the organization. And because of that, we can target interventions to impact those low civility teams. So an entire organization may not need civility training. If you've got some high performing groups that get along well, and importantly, maybe from the qualitative work that you've done, you know that this certain groups get along well, that there's a sense of inclusion in that. You don't necessarily have to spend the time and the resources to undertake a civility intervention across the entire organization. Instead, you can save time and money by, for example, administering a civility assessment and identifying where there are areas of need, and then target those areas of need. Also, by conducting a civility assessment organization-wide, you can get a baseline to measure progress over time. So if you undertake some interventions within a team, what we typically do, we do a pre and a post. So we do when I say pre, that would be before any civility training intervention. We would do administer civility assessment, do the training, and then after the training, and not necessarily the day that it's finished, but allow a little bit of time, and then do a post training assessment. And by doing that, you can track changes over time. And you can also do this with an organization. If you do give an organization-wide civility assessment, you give it on an annual basis. If obviously there's going to be a change in the makeup of teams as time goes on, you can identify some areas where civility might be slipping a little bit. And if that is the case, then again, you can spend your time and resources targeting those specific teams and not necessarily doing an organization-wide civility training on an annual basis. So the identification, the next section is the identification of the 5 key dimensions of workplace civility. This is giving a little bit of what we're going to talk about away, because remember, up to now, all of the surveys and assessments of civility and incivility were basically just an overall assessment of civility. So what we did is we recognized there was that need, so we wanted to develop a new measure or a new way to measure team civility, and we wanted to develop it, the right way. And like a lot of things in life, the right way takes some time. It takes some blood, sweat, and tears. You just can't do this, on a Saturday, between games at a bowling alley. Not that there's anything wrong with bowling. I like to bowl. But, you just can't do it quickly. It takes time. And developing an assessment the right way, and this is not only for civility assessments, but really any kind of employee assessment. You should generate a lot of different questions or items, even concepts that reflect a common understanding of that concept. And for here, we generated over 150 items that we thought measured civility in the workplace. But once you generate a whole bunch of items, you test those items on literally hundreds of employees. Yes, you could test them on students. There's nothing wrong with students, but what you'd like to do is to have your test population be as close to the actual population that you're going to use this assessment on. And ideally, you'd like to do it on people who are working full time. Then what you do is you compare the items or the questions that you've developed to similar and to different, constructs. So if we're supposed to be measuring civility, what should it be related to? And what should it not be related to? When we were developing this, we thought civility might be related to, for example, fairness or justice, something called organizational justice. If folks feel that they're being treated with respect, they probably feel that their perceptions of organizational justice are high as well. That would be something where you compare civility to something and you hope to find that there's some similarity there. And then you also want to, and this is harder, believe it or not, is to think of concepts that are not related to civility. What should not be related to civility? And there's something called goal orientation. There's a learning goal orientation and a performance goal orientation. And whether or not your goal orientation is to want to learn or to perform, that probably doesn't have a lot, or at least not as much, commonality with civility as, say, fairness. So the idea when you're developing an assessment the right way is you come up with a whole bunch of questions. You test those questions on a whole bunch of workers, and then you compare those questions to other assessments that it should be related to and should be unrelated to. By doing this, you're developing an assessment that's not just by intuition or chance. Instead, you're developing a reliable and valid measure. And that's what we did when we developed a measure of workplace civility. I mentioned that our research group had generated over 150 team civility items. Now, we had no expectation that we're going to keep all 150 items. So we knew it was going to be somewhere less than 150. We didn't know how many. But we had a feeling that 150 was probably a lot. So That's what we came up with 150, and we reduced those items, those questions across 2 different studies. We had in this research group, we had people write questions, and we combined similar questions. So many times, I shouldn't say many, oftentimes there were a couple questions that were very, very close to one another. And as a group, we decided which question of these 2 that were very, very similarly worded, which one did we like better? Because there's no reason to test basically the same question twice. We deleted other items that the group said, you know what, that doesn't sound like civility. So something that somebody may have wrote a question or 2 that we thought was something else. Maybe it was fairness, maybe it was goal orientation, maybe it was something else, but we didn't think it was civility, so we would get rid of it. Now, I will say the bar was low with that. I mean, if there was a chance it was civility, we kept it in. But if we all agreed, no, that's not really civility, there was no reason to test it, so we deleted those kind of questions. We only kept reliable questions. So once we collected the data on hundreds of workers, we only kept those items or those questions that had high reliability, and we only kept the items that were related to those similar concepts. So if we found that some items were related to other concepts we thought were dissimilar, well, that must not be civility then. So we deleted those items. At the end of this, we ended up collecting a sample from 2 different studies comprised of members who work full-time. The average age was 34.7 years. There were over 900 people across the 2 studies. We did a statistical analysis called factor analysis that was very surprising, because when we started out with this assessment development, we had no preconceived notions about how many factors there might be. In fact, we thought there would be 1, because up until that point, all the other assessments that we were aware of that had more than 4 items had, in fact, all of the surveys had 1, if you will, 1 factor or 1 dimension. There's one 4-item assessment that talks about coworker civility, but they didn't have any other factors. So we kind of thought, well, that must be what the general factor of civility is. So we had no preconceived notions of having multiple factors of civility. We just wrote items based on what the research had been saying and what those other overall measures were. When we did this factor analysis, we thought we made a mistake, because that factor analysis produced 5 different factors of civility. But it accounted for over 55% of the variance, which is pretty darn good. So we were perplexed. We thought we did a good job in developing the items. We accounted for a good portion of the variance, but we had 5 factors. When we looked at those 5 factors, though, the questions themselves began to make sense. Within those items that comprise those 5 factors, they all had sufficient levels of, or acceptable levels of reliability. We looked at something called coefficient alphas, and they range from 0.77 to 0.95. Now, you may not be a stat head like maybe I am, but let me just tell you that when you're developing an assessment, you need it to be consistent, because if it's not consistent, there's no way that it can be useful or valid. I mean, if you take an assessment on Tuesday, I don't know, and it says that, you're very satisfied with your job, and then you take it on Friday and it says you're very dissatisfied with your job, that's not a very reliable assessment. What do you do? Who gets training? Who gets to participate in focus groups? I don't know, because I don't know if a person's satisfied or dissatisfied. I always use the example of a scale. If you get on a scale and it says you weigh 170 and you get off the scale, it resets to 0. You get back on the scale and it says you weigh 195. You go, that must be a mistake. You get off the scale, let it reset. You get on the scale and it says you weigh 130. And then your roommate says, how much do you weigh? You're like, I have no idea. I have no idea. So you need an assessment to be reliable in order for it to be useful or valid. And the acceptable levels are 0.7 and above. Anything that's above 0.7 is good and is sufficient. These 5 factors of civility that we identified range from 0.77 to 0.95, so they were reliable. We could count on them providing us with consistent results. The factor items themselves, so all across these 5 factors, they did not have the same number of questions. Some of them had as few as 3, some of them had as many as 9, but overall, we landed on having 30 questions or 30 items of civility that measured 5 factors. And we call this measure the multi-factor assessment of civility. So it had 5, as I mentioned, 30 items, 5 factors, and these are the 5 factors that we looked at, that we identified. Again, hadn't been done before in the research, but we identified, and I'll give you some examples here in a second, of civility consisting of individual civility, coworker civility, supervisor civility, work environment civility, and civil communication. Now, what do we mean by those? Well, here's a definition, if you will, of individual civility. It's the extent to which an individual believes he or she engages in behaviors themselves that foster a civil work environment. So I can't give you all 30 questions, but I can give you an example of each of these. An example question of individual civility is, I work with an attitude that fosters a respectful environment in the workplace. That is a question that comprises that individual factor. And you can see when the word I in this question, I work with an attitude, how that kind of goes back to the individual and what the individual does to contribute or perhaps not contribute to a respectful work environment. Another factor, coworker civility. Now, we weren't surprised by this because, again, there was that one assessment, that one 4-item assessment that looked at coworker civility, but they didn't identify any other factors. Coworker civility, the extent to which coworkers treat each other in a civil manner. An example of coworker civility is respect is reciprocated between coworkers. We mentioned in part 1 how respect is a key component of civility, and you're seeing this in some of the items that we have. But again, looking at the different factors and the different items that comprise those factors, coworkers is part of that question. So, and the questions that comprise those coworker civility items all have the word coworkers or some variation of that. Another factor, supervisor civility. This is the extent to which the employee's direct supervisor engage in civil behavior. Now, this is important because when we were writing questions, we had direct supervisor, and then we had senior management or upper management. The senior management, upper management questions never really provided good results. Probably because that our thinking was that might have been a little bit too vague or nebulous. When you say upper management, who do you mean? Or senior management, who do you mean? But your direct supervisor was clear enough that it provided us with good, what we'd call psychometric results. And an example of supervisor civility is, my manager is courteous towards me. Again, notice that the question is saying my manager, or other ones say my supervisor. But again, when we looked at how these items fell out, one of the factors had all the terms like my manager or my supervisor. Of course, that's civility, supervisor civility. Our 4th factor was work environment civility. This is the extent to which an organization has high expectations and places a great deal of importance in a civil workplace. So this is, if you think about it in terms of in terms of organizational levels, you've got the individual, you've got the team, which is the coworkers, you've got the direct supervisor, and this 4th one is like the work environment itself. Does this organization have high expectations about respect in the workplace? And again, here's an example question. In my work culture, there's an expectation to be civil. Not talking about the person's direct supervisor or themselves or their coworkers, but talking about in essence, the overall organization. Is there an expectation to be civil in this work culture? Finally, the one that was maybe a little bit interesting was the civil communication. This stood on its own, had very good reliability. And again, kind of shows that when you write a whole bunch of questions, you're not sure what you're going to get, but we found enough questions to have a factor. And we call this civil communication, which is the extent to which appropriate verbal or nonverbal communications exist in the workplace. An example of civil communication is, and this is again an example question, sarcasm is inappropriately used in my workplace. Now, if somebody says, I strongly agree with that, that would not be an example of civil communication. We would what we call reverse score that, and that would be low civil communication if somebody says they strongly agree with this. So this is what we would call a reverse scored item. But again, there were questions that separated themselves from the other factors that clearly talked about how people communicate with one another. And it's not always what they say, sarcasm is, but some of the other questions talk about nonverbal communication. And again, that was a standalone factor that we found. So those are the 5 factors that we found of workplace civility that we were not expecting to find. But once you take a couple steps back and you look at it over, it makes sense how there's different organizational levels of civility within an organization. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Chad, who will talk to us about how this measurement contributes to other organizational studies.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Mark. So now that you've had an opportunity to see some of the measurement components behind civility in the workplace and the different dimensions, and you've probably gotten ideas of, what the impact may be within organizations and what it may look like to look at measuring civility in the workplace. I wanted to provide a couple examples of what it might look for 2 specific types of organizational studies. So these 2 have gotten a lot more name recognition and publicity in more recent years, as we've noticed, more interest in investments around DEI and in ways to move the needle in terms of representation and in inclusion initiatives and efforts in the workplace. So these 2 types of studies I'll talk about. So one is the racial equity review, also referred to generally as the civil rights audits, with some nuances and twists, but generally a similar type of studies. So these can be thought of as comprehensive reviews of an organization's current DEIA efforts and organizational culture to look at barriers and gaps, especially in terms of developing recommendations to address and improve those barriers. So, some of the ways or methods used in conducting these studies can involve qualitative and quantitative measures. So in terms of quantitative data that may be looked at, so things like availability analyses, so looking at who in the workforce might be available versus who is actually represented in the workforce. Things in terms of looking at organization A compared to competitors or benchmarks in the industry as a whole, looking at EEO disparities in claims against the organization, other things like timing analyses. So in terms of projections of how long it might take an organization to go from one representative measure to reaching another measure of representation over a certain time frame, and just a number of more quantified numerical data sources can be used in the quantitative analysis to give a view of what the organization looks like. Also, in terms of qualitative approaches, so looking at policies and procedures in the organization and generally how those are received. So talking to people in the organization, like through interviews or focus groups, or looking at programs such as DEI training or mentorship programs, and getting a sense of what the experience is like within those programs, can give a qualitative feel for what organizations are doing well and what they aren't doing quite as well. And then using these methods, working with clients, there's a lot of flexibility. So, what one study might look like for one organization can look completely different than what it might look like for another organization. So talking with the leadership of the organization to get a feel of what the challenges might be for one organization. So, the diversity dimensions might, to be assessed might be very different depending on the specific challenges of the organization. So this method of review and assessment can be very flexible and adaptive for organization. And so, using qualitative, quantitative, or a blend of those can help, really kind of pinpoint the barriers for those organizations. So in thinking about, the assessment of civility and the different dimensions of civility, that fits nicely within a qualitative assessment within a racial equity review or a civil rights audit. Essentially, we're giving a current state snapshot of the organization in terms of, something very valuable and meaningful to the organization. As I kind of led off in looking at some of the outcomes associated with higher and lower incidences of civility. Looking at the current state of civility would give a good picture of, what to target and a path forward in terms of fleshing out a real actionable strategy to making improvements in civility. So then in kind of looking at the second type of organizational study, I might talk about something known as ESG reporting. So for this, this is essentially not a necessarily new type of reporting, but a type of reporting that's gotten a lot of publicity lately. So here, the E corresponds to environmental impacts. So thinking about things such as the organization's carbon footprint, pollution levels, sustainability challenges in terms of the supply chain, the social component, so which is, what we're kind of focusing on right now, things that, policies, procedures that impact individuals. So both individuals inside the organization in terms of employees and stakeholders, as well as people outside the organization. So in terms of communities and the environment in which the organization might sit, or individuals with which the organization does business. So we can think of, groups such as racial and ethnic minorities, or LGBT community, or underrepresented genders, and many others. And then even carrying that idea even farther in terms of the organization, in terms of how they might, place their investments and resources in terms of taking stances against certain global phenomenon and wider international type stances. And then the G corresponds to general governance, as to how the organization manages itself and establishes its leadership. So things like maybe the composition of its board of directors and top echelons of leadership and what that may look like. So ESG reporting is essentially a method of establishing accountability and transparency of the organization. So these reports now more and more frequently are being released and published to the public on certain routine bases and made known to the public as a way of being able to monitor organizations' progress. So where what we're talking about today in terms of measuring civility sits, well and clearly into the S factor, or the social component. So looking at the way organizations, structure things, and basically the current state of how organizations and members within the organizations treat each other with regard to civility and respect, would lend well to being something that could be reported as part of an ESG report. Also, in terms of really communicating where the organization is and where it's going, looking at changes, over time. So as Mark mentioned in talking about some of the measurement pieces, a very popular and impactful method to study can look at pre and post measures. So, seeing where the organization currently is in terms of how it is in terms of civility treatment, and how that has shifted the delta over time, and kind of looking at how civility has moved as a result of initiatives and efforts that have been placed. So yeah, two potential avenues for organizational studies that could well house civility research and measurement with organizations to communicate potential progress within the civility and treatment of organizational members. So next we'll go ahead and focus on the proper interpretation of results and some potential action steps resulting from looking at the assessment of civility. And I'll turn it back over to Mark. Mark?
All righty. Thank you, Chad. What we're going to do in this section is briefly kind of talk about how you can use the survey results. First of all, how to interpret them, how to communicate them, but then also what to do with them. So imagine like this workplace scenario here. So customers of ABC company are complaining about late deliveries. So the customers are complaining of late deliveries. The shipping supervisor says there's some conflict among employees that are impacting the productivity. The HR director looks into this, and she's received several complaints that a member of the team is abusive or disrespectful toward other team members, yelling at them when things go wrong and things like that. When questioned about this employee, the supervisor states that this is one of his best employees and he cannot afford to lose him, especially given the fact that they're already struggling with on-time deliveries. And you might even add to this, and especially given this climate of having difficulty finding good employees. So let's say this is the case. So this is something that's literally impacting the bottom line of an organization. What would you do to intervene? What would you do if there's certainly an aura of disrespect, at least in the shipping department? What would you do? Would you invoke discipline? Would you discipline the employee? Would you discipline the supervisor? Would you coach the supervisor? Would you conduct a team building activity? By doing the reviews that Chad spoke of, in addition to using a survey, such as the multi-factor approach, it can help make answering this question of what to do a lot easier by telling you where to focus your efforts. It may be the supervisor that's really just allowing this to happen. The supervisor, him or herself, may be also abusive and may not see anything wrong with that type of behavior. It may be more than just one coworker. It may be everyone within the team. At what level? Heck, there might even be a work environment situation where the work environment allows disrespect and exclusion to occur in that work environment. So what could you do? Well, with that 5-factor approach that we talked about, you can measure those previous. Remember, those previous measures of incivility and civility consist of only one factor, but this current measure that we just spoke of consists of 5 distinct factors, which then can allow you to engage in a more targeted intervention. It can help you identify sources of low civility and then go attack it. Here's a report on the next slide, slide 34 actually, that shows a report that we typically create to help a team or an organization understand where they are in relation to civility. If you can use this to compare the team if only one team partakes in the civility assessment, or the entire organization. But because a lot of times when we're called in, it's because they think that there's an issue with a team like the shipping department, and we just go to that shipping department. Regardless, what we do is whether it's the team, a single team, or an organization, is we provide them percentiles for not only their overall civility score, but each of those multi-factor assessment civility factors. And we compare it to our population averages. So we've got about 2,000, a little bit more than 2,000 people in our database now. And we compare their assessments of these 5 factors to that population. And here's an example report. You can see pretty quickly that in individual civility and in work environment civility, they're doing pretty well relative to the population. For coworker civility and supervisor civility, it's about average, but there seems to be a problem with civil communication. They're certainly lower than the population average. They're at the 25th percentile. They're probably not communicating very well. They're using a lot of inappropriate verbal and or nonverbal communication. So this report can help, again, begin to identify where you need to attack your pockets of low civility. On slide 35, what you can do is also compare the team to the overall organization average. Now, on the previous slide, coworker civility was about average relative to the population. But for a team, a particular team, they may be relatively lower compared to the organization average. So what we can do is we can compare the means of the team or the work group to the organization's mean for each MAC factor. And in this case, you can see that, like for this hypothetical work group, they had scored lower than the organization in terms of coworker civility. So although relative to the population, they're about average, relative to the organization, they're below average. So this gives you 2 pieces of information relative to the population and relative to the organization, if you go organization-wide, that can help you determine what types of actions you need to take in order to increase not only perception, but reality of inclusion in the workplace. Why it matters? Again, why does all this matter? What we've found is that civility, workplace civility, is a multidimensional construct, and it requires a multidimensional approach. In fact, I would argue that it requires an approach in terms of measurement from different angles. The reviews that Chad was talking about, the qualitative, that's the word I'm looking for, the qualitative reviews that Chad was talking about, along with a quantitative survey. You know, this survey is only 30 items. It takes about 5 minutes to complete, so it's not going to take away a whole lot of time from employees. But understanding that civility is on a continuum from low to high, and that it can vary across these different factors, can impact how we approach improving team civility. What do we do? Do we do individual coaching? Do we do a team building exercise? We may need to do an organization-wide intervention if across the board there's a feeling that this organization does not value civility. By measuring that team civility across all 5 factors, again, allows us to target our interventions at those different organizational levels, at the individual level, at the work group level, at the supervisor level, and at the organizational levels. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Chad, who will take us home on this webinar.
All right, thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of our content for this installment. And we wanted to give a heads up of what to expect on our 3rd and final installment of the series. So, and that one is building a culture of civility. So for that third session, we'll help to identify more prescriptive means and what to do next with the findings. So we'll be talking about some of the longer term ways to create a culture of civility, and who might be responsible for some of that change management, and what some of the more prominent examples of change management may be in practical ways employers can foster civility in the workplace. So that webinar will take place on April 12th, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern. Please register for it. Again, we thank you for watching and your participation. Feel free, again, to email us at news@dciconsult.com. We'll answer all questions we receive on the webinar itself directly, and we look forward to joining you on the third installment. And take care, and thank you.
Take care, everyone.